Welcome to Hunter's War. My name is Hunter, and this is a podcast about the intersection of geopolitics, war, and society. Today, we have a conversation with Inès Abdel, the co-director of the Palestine Institute for Public Diplomacy. In our conversation, we talk about why it may be a distraction to focus on the recognition of the Palestinian state, the fragmented nature of Palestinian civil society, the challenges that Palestinians face organizing for their own rights at home and internationally, and the complicity of the international community, especially the US and Europe, in the ongoing occupation of Palestine and the genocide in Gaza. We have this conversation in the shadow of the Israel-Iran conflict, but it's important to highlight the work that the Palestine Institute for Public Diplomacy is doing. As always, my email is hunter@hunterswar.com. Let's talk to Inès. Inès, thank you for joining. Before we start, if you don't mind sharing a little bit about yourself, about who you are and why you do this work.
Thank you for having me. So I'm Inès. I'm Palestinian and French. From my mother's side, they're French, and my father was a Palestinian refugee in Lebanon. My entire father's family was expelled in 1948 during the Nakba, the catastrophe for the Palestinians, during the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. When Israel was created, their village was depopulated and destroyed, and they went to Lebanon. And then my father immigrated to France. Basically, my entire life was between France and Lebanon and Palestine. And now I decided on my own to move back 8 years ago. And I've been working in Palestine ever since.
And how did you get into this work specifically around diplomacy and advocacy and campaigning?
I think a lot of people can see, right, on social media, and us Palestinians, especially those growing in diaspora, we have this bridge between our homeland and where we grew, where our second home is. It's part of our identity. So I think it's something that almost we don't necessarily choose. It's always been living with me. And of course, my trajectory has evolved in terms of where do I feel like we best can defend our cause for liberation, for our rights. And so that obviously that journey took different forms and many years and led me to where I am today at the PIPD and really doing what we call people's diplomacy, alternative diplomacy, kind of international, building strategic alliances, awareness, and trying to bring political change internationally for Palestine in a context where basically our national liberation movement, the way it existed yesterday or many years ago, is not there anymore. So doing it through what we call civil society.
And why do you call it alternative diplomacy?
Because the official diplomacy of the PLO, PA, right, like the sort of bodies that used to represent the Palestinian cause, because of multiple political factors, including the Oslo agreements and the failed Middle East peace processes, and basically what has led to further entrenching the Israeli control and the Israeli colonial control over Palestinians. Today, these institutions don't represent Palestinians anymore. And so the problem is that all of these institutions and structure that existed in the time of Yasser Arafat and that were sort of created in the 60s, 70s are no longer neither very proactive nor too legitimate. So in terms of how can we really make an impact internationally in 2025, and we've seen this obviously since the beginning of the genocide, Palestinians for their cause, the way they are speaking out, the way they are organizing, the way they are advocating and lobbying has taken different forms that are not the same ones as the formal embassies and PLO, PA have been doing.
Could you share a bit more about the Palestinian civil society and what challenges does it face when it tries to organize and advocate for itself?
One thing that we really need to keep in mind is that decades, more than 77 years of colonial control by Israel, one of the core strategy and consequence of it has been the fragmentation of the Palestinian people. Through ethnic cleansing, exile, now genocide, isolating each other from one another. So the siege and the blockade on Gaza for 17 years, we could not meet Gazans. We could not go to Gaza. That was forbidden. Last time I was in Gaza was 2003. And the full blockade began in 2007. And then you have, Palestinian refugees in refugee camps in Lebanon. We cannot go to Lebanon right now, Syria, and the fragmentation even within the West Bank. So right now, especially after 7 October, the new normal or the facts on the grounds they're trying to make reality is also that we cannot go to Nablus or Jenin a few kilometers away because we're surrounded by checkpoints. That fragmentation obviously had very real consequences on our people. And so I think the biggest challenge today for us is how do we unite? How do we create, how do we fight for our unified, cause? Because they've created so much different realities that today, when you're sitting in Ramallah or Jerusalem or Haifa or Gaza, your reality is extremely different from, one another. And so that is a reality that shapes both the social life, the economic life, the political life, and that includes civil society. And what do we put in civil society? I think it's important to also understand that the way that our cause has evolved from the idea that we need to liberate, and I think we're coming back to that, but I think in the period since the 80s, the American involvement and sort of the Israeli agenda has led us to kind of move into sort of bilateral negotiations, the idea that we would be kind of two parties on an equal footing that would just need to discuss and negotiate. And therefore, all of the infrastructure around that has been built. The Palestinian Authority was created as this interim body inside Palestine to deal with Palestinian affairs while Israel remained in control, and kind of pretending that Palestinians regained agency, but effectively without any sovereignty, without any control, and with further fragmentation. And so that also led to the entire liberation movement and activism, student unions, workers' unions, to move into NGOization, right? Like the professionalization of NGOs and depoliticization at the same time of these NGOs. So everything we live is political. Like me giving birth to my son, to buying water, everything has a relation to the colonial control of our bodies, our resources, our lives by Israel. And so I think it's important to understand that in that context, what we call civil society takes many different forms and shapes today and is actually being redefined as we speak. And so for us at PAPD, we think for now there is no anchor, there's no political anchor to what we do, because the leadership of the PLO-PA in power doesn't want to do election. They're like effectively blocking, of course, with the support and sponsorship of their supporters and donors. Israel, the US, Europe have a vested interest into the status quo staying the same. So the space we have is civil society. But in a sense that I think we need to understand more broadly, because in an ideal situation, and that's what we're aiming for, is that if we have a unified liberation political movement that is organized, we would be part of that to shape sort of the foreign affairs, foreign policy of that. But that's not there. So hence why we do it through NGOs and CSOs and working with grassroots groups and all of the different collectives that have emerged and are working eventually towards shaping our political future.
Tell me, what is the why of the work you do, of PIPD? What's the why behind the organization?
I think one simple word is complicity, because the only people who can liberate ourselves are the Palestinians. But the obstacles to that are international, whether it's from the repression of the solidarity to the selling of weapons to Israel, to the energy and fuel and coal and crude oil that is being sent to Israel. All of that fuels the colonial regime. And I think just because I think a lot of people also hear a lot of concepts that are a bit difficult to understand, the reality we live in, there is kind of the overall framing is we're in a settler colonial regime. It likes Zionism, the Zionist project, and Israel. The entire aim until today has been to replace the Palestinian people by Jewish people and Jewish immigrants into a Jewish state, a state that is calling itself the Jewish state, that has laws and constitutional laws that are supremacist, etc. They have adopted different tactics and systems that kind of are under that, right? Like apartheid is one, military occupation in the West Bank and Gaza is another, genocide is part and parcel also of that sort of strategy. And so I think it's important for people to understand that these are all different boxes of the sort of overall colonial strategy and approach and aim. For us, then, the question becomes, how can we make sure that the international states, governments, and companies, because we're in also an era where big tech is doing as much harm, if not more, than states in our reality. How can we make sure they do no harm and they support our agency and our self-determination? What we're asking for is can we decide for ourselves? Can you let us liberate ourselves? Can you let us build a free country? Like a country where justice, freedom, dignity can uphold. It's not a religious conflict. It's not just a conflict between two people fighting for a land. All of these narratives have been fabricated to consent. The idea that, Israel has a right to defend itself and all of these tropes. And I think that's part of what we need to do. One, for the world to understand what's going on here, like the right diagnosis for the right solutions. And second, do not be complicit. That's what we're asking. We're asking from the governments to the people. Now, obviously, we have different strategies for that because the US is extremely complicit, right? They're like, Israel is effectively sort of a US colony, military base extension in our region. And the same with Europe that has historical guilt that then we have paid the burden of, where they're not capable of even still seeing the colonial nature of where we are here because of even their colonial past and the Holocaust, which is also giving them this guilt until today that they have to protect Israel. But Israel is not protecting the Jews, but that's another conversation we can have separately. And so I think it's about first understanding what we're talking about here, like a state that has genocidal colonial aims. And so then how should these countries react? Now, again, so there's the U.S. very complicit. So what's the work that the movement can do from within in the U.S.? But also what can we strategically do to build alliances in other places? So we've worked, for example, a lot in Colombia in the past 2 years where the government then has taken the decision to stop the coal exports to Israel because 20% of Israel's electricity is still generated by coal. That coal, 60% of it comes from Colombia, and the government had the political will to advance that ban. And so we've worked a lot there with indigenous people, with unions in the mining sector, and with the government to move towards that position. That's just an example. The second part is the narrative warfare. You can see how the genocide on our people has been manufactured also by how the media is covering it. And I think the media is also complicit into facilitating some of what's happening here and the reality, whether it's by undermining Palestinian local journalists and Gaza journalists. So international journalists cannot come in. The voices of the local people are not heard. Our role is to amplify Palestinian voices, making sure that our voice, our expertise, we're the first concerned, is taken credibly, is taken into account, and is heard, and is not necessarily put in parallel with an Israeli voice to be seen as credible and legitimate. We lobby the media, we lobby the governments, we work with grassroots groups who are getting millions and still millions in the streets to protest against what's happening. And so all of it is around, like, all we ask is end your complicity, do no harm, because it's not just about what is happening to the Palestinians. We're the laboratory, we're the litmus test, but it's coming to you. And I think we've seen this, right, with now what's happening in Iran. I think people are seeing that Israel has effectively, with especially Gaza and Palestine, destroyed the international law and its institutions, any form of its credibility. The EU has completely lost credibility with its double standards when it comes to applying rules, international law, rules of engagements or any order. And all of that is really affecting the entire world, not just our people who are obviously facing existential threat of being erased.
You've always had U.S. governments that were complicit in what is happening. Now you have an administration that is so pro-Israel, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think we've seen before, an example being the sanctioning of the prosecutor of the ICC. Has that changed the work you do or the way you see it, or is it continue to do what you do because you have to?
I think it has changed the way all of us are advocating. The way that people used to put energy and resources a lot on the UN mechanisms and institutions, that doesn't work anymore. Like the ICJ is a tool, but then there needs to be an entire political strategy around it, whether it's the media, digital media, mobilization on the streets, in the courts, also like going to national courts, litigation strategies, but also workers organizing within companies that are complicit. All of these tactics and strategies are evolving, of course, because the very institutions that are holding international law have been created post-World War II by countries that are themselves complicit in many of what's happening today, not just in Palestine. And so, people have called for the UN reform for decades, but until that happens, it's not where things will change. I worked in the UN, so part of my journey was also to think that still from within the system we can change things for Palestine. We can't. It's impossible to change things from within the UN system. However, there is tools we can use. The ICJ case by South Africa against Israel, a country of the global South that has lived apartheid, taking a genocidal state that is inflicting apartheid on people to court, is politically important. Will the case itself legally be implemented? The ICJ has issued orders completely ignored both by Israel towards it, it was directly targeted to, but also third states who have obligations. We're only starting to hear today in the EU people who start saying maybe we should be aligning our policies and laws with international law, by the way, on what's happening. Can you imagine? There is more than 60,000 people who were killed. The entire territory is destroyed. The entire of Gaza is destroyed. Universities, intellectuals, hospitals, doctors, surgeons, they've all been exterminated and destroyed. We're just hearing maybe we should start thinking about potential measures to align ourselves with international law. Come on. So I think, of course, there's been multiple different ways that mobilization and political pressure work. The flotilla is one, the march to Gaza is one, but also the ways that, media works, like the fact of having Palestinian media being created, like content creators who are educating people one-on-one, one-on-one on what's happening. Candidates, in the UK who've been elected on platforms defending Palestine away from Labour or conservative platforms. All of that is small silver linings that there are things being done internationally, but it's not enough. It's not enough because the genocide continues and impunity is at the core of what's happening. Impunity and its mirror complicity are still going on, and then Iranian people are being now bombed as well. So, I think we are constantly evolving into what can we do more into pressure. And I don't think talking to the Trump administration is the way. I think it's how can the Trump administration be pressured, because we know that they want to do harm. That's just a given. And so how do we also strategically work towards that? And we can see, I think, very clearly things like the difference between the Make America Great Again supporters versus the Make Israel Great Again supporters. Within Trump's camps, you have those who, the Make America Great Again people despise immigrants. I don't subscribe to their ideology at all. But they also question why U.S. support to Israel is so unconditional, because they want their taxpayer money to go towards Americans, which is a fair point as well.
To go back a little bit to the work you guys are doing, you're talking about the advocacy and the mobilizing and the organizing of groups, for example, in Colombia to put pressure on governments. You also have a strong digital platform where you promote the voices of Palestinians and the work that's being done there. Tell me about that digital platform and how you all use it as part of this advocacy.
Yeah, so our organization and our platform, Robert, I think we have two aims. One, making sure we amplify Palestinian stories and voices. Again, because we can see it now. One, people are normalizing the genocide. There is at least 50 to 100 people in Gaza per day who are killed, like today. And many of them are shot because they're just wanting to get food. Like people are going to get bags of flour and they get shot. That's the reality. But because the world is turning its eye away and it's normalizing and it's getting numb to that suffering, we're not seeing it. So our role is to fight this numbness, fight the dehumanization of our people. And that's through stories, that's through perspectives, that's through our people. That's the biggest strength we have. We don't have much oil or minerals or, we have our people. We don't have control over our land. We have our love for our land and homeland and our people, who are everywhere effectively because of ethnic cleansing and genocide. Like we have Palestinians who live across the world. So we're trying to also make sure we amplify those voices and we organize, we support the organizing of those voices. The second is, I think, being part of an ecosystem where we need much more education to the people in understanding, making sense of the situation beyond the news. Because people have seen, they know what Gaza is. They know our children are being burnt alive and put in bags, plastic bags, but that doesn't somehow make it to people to understand what's needed. So we need to be able to also make the people understand that what is required in the short term to the longer term. What does that mean? And so I think that's another important thing. Like, what can you do? What are the campaigns and the groups you should follow? What are the tactics and strategies that work to fight that? And so that's where the digital space is. Now, the digital space is not enough. Okay, it's a tool, but I think we've seen the problem is that the other side of that coin is the use of cyberspace and the use of the digital spaces to repress. If Iran has asked people to delete WhatsApp, it's not for no reasons. That Meta has been targeting, including in Gaza. They've been providing information, targeted information, including in Lebanon, with like who are in the same WhatsApp groups, like locating people and targeting groups, peoples, buildings, because of different use of social media. Censorship is very high. Our content is heavily shadow banned. Like anything we do gets absolutely a tiny bit of the attention that it should, because it's deliberate shadow banning and censorship. And there is repression also, and harassment and smearing on those platforms. So we're not in the Arab Spring era of 2010, right? Where social media was this great tool that we thought would organize our liberation. It's turned also against us into a tool to further surveil and control us. And we need to be very careful. And also, how do we use that smartly to not put a target on our back for them to even further control us as a people?
You mentioned a few things there that I think we could spend hours talking about each of them, from just the sheer amount of death in Gaza. It's humanity shocking what is happening, and people just don't respond, or as you said, become numb, which is insane to believe that you can become numb to setting up a Israeli-American supported almost death trap for people who are starving. And it's just disgusting the way that we kind of just pass by it. That's one thing. I think that the social media and the use of technology as a weapon as well, it's important to highlight that you do, and that it is both a tool to get the message out, but definitely something that is being used to, as we started with, limit civil society's ability to organize and coordinate and spread a message. I want to maybe talk for a second on that last piece, which is, you mentioned the censorship and the shadow banning, but it makes me think about the fact that your existence as a Palestinian is offensive in some scenarios. As you do international advocacy, as you just say the word Palestine, if you just have the flag, people consider that anti-Semitic, or they're offended by the existence of Palestinians, which gets to the whole root of the challenge. But how do you advocate in some of these contentious areas where just your existence is questioned or is considered offensive?
Yeah, so I think that has a very clear reality. One, a lot of doors are closed to us when we are Palestinians, but we are trying to push those doors and to also create alliances, again, in countries. The international world order is changing, and we need to ensure that the countries who don't agree with the U.S. hegemony and the U.S.-Israel hegemony right now are fighting back and organizing. Unfortunately, again, the UN is no multilateral system that works. So part of our work we do in Brazil, in Colombia, with the South Africa, there is a diplomatic group now being created called the Hague Group that we hope can move somewhere into holding Israel accountable together. Of course, the BRICS, is another avenue where I think Palestine could be stronger on the agenda of like, what are these countries able to do in terms of their politics, or even just economic, financial thinking around Israeli colonial interests in the region that are destabilizing and endangering, again, not just our people very clearly, but the entire region. All of that is what we're trying to do, to push those doors where in places where, frankly, Palestine has been absent for a very long time. So even, just informing, having a presence, getting the right information to the right people in those places is important, outside the West. But in the West, there is a critical work we're doing also with the Palestinian diaspora, like the Palestinian communities in the US, in Germany, in France, in the UK are important, and they talk to each other, and they're more and more coordinated with each other, trying to organize. That's absolutely super important. And that's the way we're also fighting back, by trying to increase our organizing. And something that, again, the Palestinian voices in those spaces are extremely important. And we've seen this having an impact in the US.
Looking at Palestinian leadership. So you talked about the kind of separation from the political, just due to the situation, that you're not necessarily able to be a part of or grab onto those institutions, but part of the goal is to create a world in which you can politically advocate for Palestine. What are the new models of leadership for Palestinians moving forward?
I think the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, that was supposed to be the representative of the Palestinian people, that completely was taken over by the Palestinian Authority. Like, it was emptied, delegitimized, and now the Palestinian Authority, which effectively was created under Oslo for 5 years as an interim body. It's like colonial India. You had Indian local people who would just maintain the colonial order, right? Who would work for the British, but would be sort of this autonomous local governorates. That is what we have. That's what the PA is, right? Like, who controls the borders, who controls the water, the electricity, the imports, export, the markets. All of that is captive and under the control of Israel and the Israeli regime. So it's important to understand that, because whatever you do as reforming that system, you overall need a political body politic for the Palestinians, like a liberation movement that is representative of today's society. The current factions, the main factions like Hamas and Fatah, they're more responsive to their own interest and their sponsors and their, international supporters than to their own people. And that creates the dynamics today, right? Like, you have Mahmoud Abbas as a president who 90% of the people want to see go. That's polls, that's actual, there's regular polls of opinions of people. He appointed his kind of loyal lackey as a vice president who doesn't represent anyone, but who's the one who holds the line with the Israelis, has the trust of the Israelis, is coordinating affairs to get people their permit, to get people to actually survive under occupation. And he's the guy who's supposed to take over. He has absolutely zero popular legitimacy. That's who's in power, but they have the support of the Americans and the Israelis. And so for us, it's how do we create a change to that? And there's pressure from different places, but when you do pressure, you are harassed by the Israelis first, and then the PA, who are obeying Israeli orders. You are put in prison, you can be killed. So there's multiple leadership opportunities in different communities, and who could come together and be part of that change, but they're either in prison, killed, or silent because the risk is too high. Now in exile, there is more efforts, because obviously the space is a bit more open when you're not in Palestine under direct occupation and genocide. However, again, that's where Israel is trying very proactively to repress any sort of organizing by Palestinians, by smearing, by, trying to basically make them lose their citizenship, being deported, being put in detention. I mean, Mahmoud Khalil's case, obviously in the US, is very now one of the examples, right? Is how do you silence people who are just working for their cause? So it has obviously ripple effect outside of, so that's the obstacles to the organizing. But there are different efforts that have been, again, created that are decentralized. So you have, whether it's grassroots initiatives at the very community level for people to discuss politics, to discuss what can they do in the very short term in their spaces. It's also conference happening outside of different Palestinian diaspora intellectuals, communities coming together to discuss how to pressure the PLO to change. So there are these different efforts. It also is both encampments outside or even encampments inside that had happened as kind of political attempts at organizing when a community is in danger. Like, they put up tents to save a Bedouin community from being expelled or being taken over by settlers. All of these are attempts at political organizing that have not come together in one umbrella, because the vested interest to keep the political status quo are very high, unfortunately. And the social engineering and the political engineering, even that we see in Gaza, the very fact that they're trying to replace the humanitarian system outside of the UN and INGOs and so on, that I have a lot of criticism towards, but it was a system there that they're trying to replace by private actors with zero accountability, but that have Palestinian clients and groups that have vested interest in managing. And these people are then answering to Israeli and US interests. That's very here political engineering they're doing so that we don't liberate ourselves, so that we don't actually create an alternative political movement.
Maybe one last question before I close it off. You talked about the UN kind of international institutions and the challenges or non-progress with those. What is your feeling about France's attempts or conversation about recognizing a Palestinian state? Does that make a difference? Is that helpful?
I'm personally of the view that recognition is counterproductive because it is escapism. It is escaping from taking the needed measures that are what's needed to this moment, to be up to really the scale and the urgency of the moment. Now, other people think that recognition can be, like Palestinians say that it can be a start, but recognition, unfortunately, the way it has happened, has been a very symbolic move. A symbolic move that has been taken so countries can tap themselves in the back and say, look, we've spent a lot of diplomatic time and energy to recognize. But in fact, there's 140 plus countries recognizing Palestine. What's the reality? Further genocide, destroying whatever state would be. There's no Gaza anymore. So what state are you recognizing? So I think it's completely disconnected from the reality. It has not effectively changed the reality on the ground and Israel's impunity. And Israel knows that. So what's important to understand is that it is kind of shielding away Israel from accountability. What's needed is Israel to pay a price, to pay a cost for its genocide and continued decades of colonization of Palestine. And we go back to the idea that impunity and complicity are at the center of that. Recognizing Palestine is not going to end your complicity. If you continue to send weapons, like allow the shipment of weapons to Israel, like France does, or the UK, that continue to send military equipments and parts of military equipments, and then you talk about recognizing, that's hypocrisy. That's like utter hypocrisy. So no, I don't think in this moment recognition is the priority. And I think the other thing we need to keep in mind is Israel. And I think the world hopefully is starting to recognize that. But they're operating in bad faith. They're operating on lies and disinformation. Propaganda is the way they operate. They've always been operating for their own colonial agenda. The problem is that the utter, of course, like underlying racism and Islamophobia that I think we're also kind of associated to as a Palestinian people, that dehumanization, racism, and so on, is obviously affecting the entire situation and how people perceive Israel versus Palestinians. And it's the same with Iran. Like you would say people would totally be okay by people saying, you know, ooh, the bad Iranians, the destabilizing bad regime and country, versus Israel, who's given this benefit of the doubt of being a democracy, being this like country that has rules and is a rational with good faith. No, Israel has bad faith, lies repeatedly, fabricates information for its own interest. And I think that we're seeing that also with the way that they deal with diplomacy. They kind of fabricate and over-exaggerate outrage over anything. The fact that France, they covered some booth of armed companies in that military affair, they called it anti-Semitic. Recognition, they were like going to, you know, they called the ambassadors out. They're like, we're going to retaliate. This is unacceptable. But they absolutely know that this is not going to affect them. And so they kind of fabricate, exaggerate this outrage so that people think this is a huge step that these countries took. So that then they can just relax when Israel can continue what they're doing and the countries are like backtracking and saying, no, but you know, we want dialogue and we want to be around the table. Sorry about this. We want to kind of calm down the situation. So the Israelis play with that. They cry wolf, they exaggerate, they use these tactics to gain time and to control time, space, and geography to advance their colonial agenda and pretend and like fabricate this sort of international outrage. And in the meantime, countries can tap themselves in the back for having done something that has pissed, you know, the Israelis. And that is diplomatic ballet. That's theatrics. That's theatrics we need to end. We need to go really beyond that for real, tangible actions that are actually potentially changing the reality on the ground.
I think that's a good place to end. Inès, thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Hunter.